So I was sitting there this morning watching all the panels and talks, and I realized that my presentation, I think, has already been given. So this is, I thought about telling y'all I was sitting back there feverishly putting together a presentation of like a summary of everything, because this is actually going to tie it all together. And it was really, couldn't have had a better tee up than the various, the four panels that we had this morning. Just 30 seconds on quantum, because it'll help kind of frame up the context and the come from of my talk. So we do all types of energy. So we got our start in traditional oil and gas and midstream, and about 14 or 15 years ago, we actually made our first investment in renewables. And we've now become one of the larger private renewable investors in the US and in Europe. And have gotten into a lot of energy transition technology. So we've got a venture fund that does nothing but energy transition technologies. And so we look at it as kind of our job is to find, basically help the world supply the energy that it needs, that's clean, that's affordable, that's abundant, it's reliable, okay? And so that's a big challenge, as we've heard from a lot of our speakers this morning. So that's what I'm gonna basically talk about here is the energy transition, energy security, and what I like to kind of call the practical realities of how this energy transition is going to play out, because I think there is a lot of misconceptions in the country today about how the energy transition is really going to play out. So that's the overall kind of direction of my talk today. And what I'd like to do is just kind of frame up 6 big themes, and then I'm going to have a couple of slides on each theme to kind of unpack those. And you've heard this concept today a number of times, that we've got this dual challenge. We've got a population that over the next 26 years or so is going to add a couple of billion people. And we also got about 1 billion people that are going to move up the economic ladder from lower income to middle income, and then from middle income up to upper income. And as people move up that economic ladder, they use a lot more energy. As more people come into the world, we need a lot more energy. And so we have to supply that energy, make sure it's available, make sure it's cheap, affordable, abundant, reliable, but we also have to make sure today it's a lot more clean, a lot less greenhouse gas emissions than we've done historically, because we've got, we're trying to tackle climate change at the same time. So that's a big challenge. The second thing is, and again, you heard a little bit about this morning, but this shale revolution that the United States embarked on in about 2005 was truly probably one of the most amazing technological and economic miracles that's happened in the world in the last 100 years. We basically took a country that was the largest importer of energy in the world and made it the largest producer of energy in the world, the largest exporter of natural gas in the world, and a large exporter of oil. Extraordinary geopolitical implications because of that, extraordinary financial implications because of that. I'm going to unpack those because that's really interlinked with energy security. Third, and again, you've heard all these themes, but I'm going to try to pull them together. Not all oil and gas is created equal. As a matter of fact, the country of origin of where those hydrocarbons are produced matters in a very significant way how ESG friendly those hydrocarbons are. And that's something that, a few years ago, this momentum of divest of hydrocarbons just picked up a tremendous amount of steam. And in Europe, they've pretty much gone all in on it. Everybody's divesting. And what we try to tell people is, if you really care about ESG, it's the worst thing you can do. It's the worst thing you can do for the environment. It's the worst thing you can do for people that you're trying to kind of create better social conditions, better corporate governance, because the United States and Canada and European countries have much higher ESG standards than anybody else in the world. And those molecules are going to get used, okay? The question is really not, are they going to get used, because they will, is where are they going to come from? So that's the third theme we'll unpack. Fourth one is, there's this energy transition that is now in full steam. Last year, we deployed globally about $1.8 trillion. For the last decade, we have been compounding the capital. The CAGR growth rate has been almost 25% a year for a decade. So we've gone from about $300 billion annually across the globe 10 years ago to $1.8 trillion this year. Will be well over $2 trillion. And then we have this IRA Act that's just kind of fueling that even in a much more significant way. Fifth, this energy transition obviously depends on minerals. And what we have to do is we have to turn vast quantities of minerals. We have to mine these minerals. We have to process and refine these minerals. And then we have to run those refined and processed minerals through factories. We have to build technologies of wind turbines, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles. And there's one issue with that, is that the supply chain, every aspect of that supply chain is controlled by one country, and that's China. And I like to say that China is the new OPEC, except they're much more powerful than OPEC ever was in oil. And so I'm going to talk about the implications of that and how that can really affect the United States energy security, geopolitical security, financial security. And then lastly, we had a mining panel, the first panel this morning, and they talked about some of the challenges. Many of these minerals, we've been mining for a very long time, and ore qualities are decreasing. And we've got to massively increase the supply of these minerals. And it's going to be very challenging. I'm going to share some of the reasons why that's going to be. So stepping back from all that is our general view is that this energy transition is going to play out over a much longer period of time than people think. It's going to cost a lot more, and it's much more complex. And we need to understand these complexities if the United States is going to maintain its leadership in the world. So with that, let's just kind of take a quick look at global energy demand. I always like to look at history and then look at what we have going forward. And so if you look historically at global energy demand in quadrillions of BTUs, you can see that on the left-hand side of that chart. We will use over 630 quadrillion BTUs of energy this year. Actually, that was what we used 2 years ago. I think this year it'll be about 650, which actually, by the way, interestingly enough, the IEA in Europe, that's what they say we'll be using in 2050 under their aggressive scenario case. But on the right side of the page, you've got the EIA, which is basically the federal government, U.S. federal government, the Department of Energy, and then the IEA is the Paris-based, kind of their counterpart over in Europe. But I think what's interesting is both of these organizations, and there's lots of projections out there, but both these organizations, really every organization out there that predicts what energy demand and our consumption will be 25 years from now, will tell you we're going to use all forms of energy, and we're going to use a lot of all forms of energy. What's interesting is if you look at the EIA, the U.S. government projects that only about 16% of our total energy in 2050 will come from renewable wind and solar, okay? If you take the most aggressive projection that the IEA has in terms of the supply being 210 quadrillion BTUs, that's their most aggressive case, and divide that into what might be a more realistic total demand case of 761, it's about 28% of global total energy in 2050 might be coming from wind and solar. And this flies in the face of the number of times I get asked by people, well, won't we be producing all of our energy from wind and solar in the next 10 or 15 years? The answer is absolutely not. In America, we might. I mean, I will say we have the potential to. I don't think we will because it's not base load, but we have a lot more potential in America than, say, Europe does. When you look at emissions, and this is something we get a lot of discussion today over emissions, and it was mentioned that the United States has actually reduced its emissions more than any other country in the world over the last 15 to 20 years. We've reduced our emissions by about 16%, okay? The problem is the two most populous countries in the world, China and India, are massively growing their emissions. And you can see what China's done. They're a few decades ahead of India. But if you want to understand what India is probably going to do over the next 2 decades, look at what China did over the last 2 decades, okay? So the United States and Europe could take our emissions to zero. And I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but in terms of what just India alone will add, they will add more than if we took ours to zero. And so you start to understand this challenge. Somebody said earlier, there's one atmosphere, and that's true. There's one atmosphere. And so we have to think about this as a global challenge. And we have all these people that are in energy poverty. They're trying to get out of energy poverty, and they're going to use any form of energy they can use to get out of energy poverty. Let's see here. Is that frozen? Okay. The other thing I always like to do before we dive into a talk is level set around energy transitions, okay? First of all, I don't like the word energy transition. John, you use the word energy, emissions transition. That's really what we're talking about doing here. But the concept of energy transition is not a new one. We have gone through multiple energy transitions over the last 200 years. The first one was coal. The steam engine made the Industrial Revolution possible. The second one was oil with the invention of the automobile, natural gas. And so you go back to the 1840s, the early 1900s. In the 1930s, we had natural gas. In the 1960s, we had nuclear. And then most recently, we've had wind and solar, okay? And what's surprising to a lot of people is the time it takes, the most market share any energy transition, any form of energy has ever garnered in its first 50 years of use is 35%, and that was coal. And that was starting from a really small denominator, okay? Oil only got to 25% after 50 years, gas 20%. So you start realizing that a couple of things is these transitions take a really long time to play out, and a big market share is like a third of the total market. And so that means we're going to be using a lot of other forms of energy. The other thing that's interesting when you look at energy transitions is that they never replace a prior form of energy. They're really energy additions. That's what we're doing. We're adding new forms of energy to the mix. So what we have here is not an energy transition. We got an energy addition with an emissions transition. That's what we're doing. We're transitioning the emissions profile. Energy independence, energy security. The United States had no energy security 20 years ago. Today, we're, in terms of developed world, we're the most energy secure country in the world because of the massive investment that we made in the shale revolution here in the United States. And when you look at it today, we produce a little over 20% of the world's oil. We produce over 25% of the world's natural gas. What this did is so misunderstood in terms of commodity prices. If you just take what prices go for today globally for natural gas, and you look at what prices very conservatively would have been for oil had the shale revolution not come along, we've probably saved the world on the magnitude of $20 to $25 trillion in energy cost over the last 20 years. We've saved America over almost $5 trillion of energy cost. It's the biggest stimulus that America has ever had for its economic engine was the shale revolution. And the problem with oil and gas is it's a depleting resource. So if we quit drilling, if all the rigs in the world shut down tomorrow and we quit drilling, by 2040, we would lose about 70% of the world's productive capacity, okay? And so we have to reinvest back into finding new resource. And these different lines on here correspond to actually demand lines to my first slide where it showed what the IEA two cases were and in the EIA case. So if you just kind of want to have a level set of what they're saying. And so we're just kind of saying just to keep production flat, which is kind of the IEA's base case that we'll need for oil and gas, we're going to have to invest about $15 trillion. That's about double what we've been investing for the last 10 years globally in the oil and gas space. And so what that means is when you look at, there's this concept we have in this industry, called reserve replacement ratios. And every decade after World War II, for the first 4 decades after World War II, the world found massive surplus of oil and gas. And that's one reason that we had the massive price collapse in the 1980s and early 1990s. But after that, the 1990s was the first, coming out of that price collapse was the first decade where we didn't replace what we used in that decade. And we dropped about half of what we used. And that reserve replacement ratio dropping that low, what that did is it set the largest run in commodity prices that we've ever seen globally. Oil went from about $10 a barrel in March of '99 to about $150 a barrel in July of '08. And gas went from about $1.50 to about $15 in the United States. Okay, so a 10 to 15-fold increase in that decade because of that massive underinvestment. And what's really unbelievable is where the reserve replacement rates have gone over the last 4 years, really the last 14 years. But the last 4 years is extraordinary. We've replaced less than 10% of what we've produced. And all I will just say is this is setting up, now the good news is the United States, this is a global number. So the United States is completely opposite of this. But globally, its prices are set on a global basis. And so this is going to be a really big challenge when you look at what's the commodity price is going to be for oil and gas over the next decade. And if you look at like the three major things that people spend money on, number one is where they live, their lodging. And in number 2 and 3, depending on where you live, is energy and food. And so we've seen massive inflation in lodging. We've seen massive inflation in food. We've actually not seen any inflation. We've seen deflation in oil and gas prices. And so all I would just say is that's been a huge tailwind that's countered tremendous inflation in other parts of the economy that probably is not going to work to our benefit over the next decade. And that doesn't just affect the energy industry. Energy input costs affect every industry. And so irrespective of where you invest, this is very relevant to you. Energy security, why is it so important? You know, it was talked about earlier what happened in Europe, that Europe spent, I think the number that Chad threw out was 800 billion euros. Our number is actually a little higher than that. We actually said Europe spent over about $1 trillion extra euros in 2022 because of the energy crisis they had as a result of energy supplies from Russia shutting off. And you think about that, the point was made is that would have funded 2 entire IRAs. It's amazing. And if we're not careful, you know, what happened in Europe, this was more for gas and power prices. That could happen very quickly when you look at the geopolitical tensions happening in the Middle East right now. 30% of all the world's oil is produced in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz has over 15% of the world's oil that flows right through it that the Houthis could shut down tomorrow if they wanted to, and oil would double overnight. So this concept, fortunately, we've got all of our oil we need here. The United States will be fine. The rest of the world will not be fine. And this is something that, you know, why energy security really matters. We used to talk about ESG and how much better American hydrocarbons were than international hydrocarbons. But we finally said, let's just put together some factual numbers that really demonstrate this. And I think this is a very powerful slide. When you look at basically the methane intensity of a hydrocarbon produced in the United States or Canada, it's got a rating of 6, okay? And that's basically, you can see the formula up top, what that is, how much methane per 1,000 tons of energy. And it's, when you look at it, and you look at what OPEC, if we don't produce the barrels here, they're gonna get produced by OPEC or Russia, which are about 60 to 65% higher methane intensity. And methane, by the way, is a greenhouse gas that, depending on the half-life, is 40 to 80 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So this is a really serious issue. And then when you look at the S in the ESG, you know, we tend to look at the Freedom House, how they kind of rank countries. They give a score. Oil and gas produced in US and Canada is over 3.3 times better from a S score, and over 6 than OPEC, and over 6 times better than Russia. And so your alternative is you either produce it here, we invest instead of divest of hydrocarbons in the West, or it's going to get produced by these countries that have a much, much worse ESG score than we do. So let's now kind of transition. I want to talk about the energy transition, and I want to talk about the issue that we have to tackle, right? So we've got this issue of climate change that's partially being caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have to think about, what is the problem? You have to frame up a problem. You have to define a problem to solve a problem. And Bill Gates wrote a great book in 2021 called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. If you haven't read it, you should. It's an amazing book. And in there, he kind of broke up the problem in 5 parts. He said about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions he called it making things, we call it manufacturing and construction. But it's basically cement, steel, plastics, the basic building blocks of society. It's about 31%. Power is number 2 at 27%, primarily from coal, but natural gas as well. And then, interestingly, the food we eat, agriculture, is almost 20%. So making food and making things is half the greenhouse gas problem. And then transportation comes in 4th at 16% and a little bit for heating and cooling. But that's the problem. That's what we got to tackle. So it's not about just, can we electrify transportation and we're going to be fine, or get rid of coal, we're going to be fine. The problem is much, much more larger than that. It's much more complex than that. And it's going to take a lot of basic science, material science investment to find breakthrough technologies to solve these big problems. And we're not putting the dollars into that that we should be. If we're going to tackle this problem of climate change, there's a number of technologies that we have to scale exponentially. Between now and 2030, and you got to start working backwards. This doesn't even get us to 2050. But to stay on target for net zero by 2050, just between now and 2030, we have to, on an annual basis, we have to increase the number of wind, basically the amount of wind power, the gigawatts of wind power we install, by a factor of 6. We have to increase the amount of solar power that we install by a factor of 14. The number of EVs sold every year by a factor of 14. The amount of green hydrogen electrolyzers by 200 times, and carbon capture and storage by 100 times. And that's just by 2030. And we got to do a lot more after that to get to 2050. And so to do that, obviously, we're going to have to find a lot more minerals, and I'm going to hit on that here in just a second. But let's look at how much capital is going in. As I mentioned earlier, massive growth. $1.8 trillion last year. The issue is when you look at it, and different groups have different estimates, but most of the credible estimates we see on the low end are probably around $4.5 to $5 trillion a year should be going into it, and as much as $7 trillion a year. So 1.8 trillion is a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what needs to be going into these technologies. The question really is, where is that capital going to come from? We were talking about that at our lunch table today. Where is all this capital? Who's going to pay for all this stuff? And the reason that these technologies require so much more minerals is because they're just more mineral intensive. If you look at the minerals that go into an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine vehicle, they require about 5 times the amount of minerals that an ICE car takes. And wind and solar require about 6 times more minerals than coal and natural gas fired power take, okay? So that's why, and you can kind of see the graph on the left and the right there in terms of what those key minerals are. But what does that practically mean? You start kind of breaking this down, you look at things like copper. We're going to have to increase the production of copper by a factor of 3. But other key minerals, it's 4 times, 5 times, 15 times, 20 plus times, okay? Now, I've spent my whole career in an extractive industry. One interesting factoid is no extractive industry has ever doubled production in a decade. We've got a lot more than doubling we got to do in a lot of these industries. And so let's look at the basically, if you think about the supply chain for the energy transition, it starts with minerals. You mine minerals, okay? And then after you mine them, you refine and process them. And after you refine and process them, you run them through factories. So let's take mining. And here we just kind of divide the world up into kind of the authoritarian regimes and the liberal democracies, okay? And being out here in California, I went ahead and called the good guys the blue team. Thought that would be appropriate. Sometimes when I give this talk in Texas, I switch that around. But so if you look at this, and I'm just going to pick on a couple of them. Let's look at cobalt. Let's look at nickel. Let's look at lithium. Okay, China controls about 4% of the supply of cobalt. Okay, most of it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But interestingly, when you look at that 4% supply, they control 66% of the refining. Okay, top left. You take something like lithium, they control 18% of the supply, but they control 62% of the refining. Take something like nickel, 9% of the supply, but yet 49% of the refining. So my question to you is, do they control those single-digit amounts? What's their market share? Or is it what they control in refining and processing? It's what they control in refining and processing, because the raw mineral means nothing, okay? But it even gets more complex after that, because when you look at turning these into the products that we need for the energy transition, China controls almost 60% of the global supply of wind turbines, over 75% of the global supply of solar modules, and about 85% of the global supply of lithium-ion batteries. Put this in context. That's one country. Saudi Arabia, who basically controls OPEC, controls 10% of global oil supply. Saudi and Russia together control 20%, and they could have price of oil at $300 a barrel tomorrow if they wanted to. They could shut down any economy in the world tomorrow if they wanted to. What can China do with this kind of market power? We need to be very careful what we ask for when we talk about we want this energy transition to come in quickly. Because the only way to do it right now is going to be almost 100% reliant on China, okay? And that's got massive, massive implications geopolitically, financially, for not only our country, but for all Western democracies. And by the way, it's going to be more expensive when we bring it back to America or we bring it back to Europe, because China has subsidized for the last 15 years to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm pretty much a government stay out of business, but in this area, if we don't have massive government engagement with business, things like the IRA, a lot of people, at least in where I live, don't like it. I love it because if we didn't have it, we'd have no hope to actually do the things we have to do. And it's going to be, we have to appreciate, it's going to take 15, 20, 25 years. It's how long it's taken China to get to this position. And they can do things. They don't have the regulatory red tape we have in America. I mean, this is a real issue. And so, we talk about, well, that's great. Let's go get some more mines going. Well, the mining panel this morning talked about this. But the average mine takes almost 17 years to go from concept to production. And different minerals and metals, some are shorter, some are longer. But that's the average, 17 years. The average cycle time globally for an oil and gas field is about 6 to 8 years internationally. In the United States, it's one or 2 years with shales. But 17 years. We got a supply issue of these minerals, and it takes a really, really long time. And that's before you can start refining and processing them and manufacturing, okay? So this thing's going to take a long time. We have got to get the red tape out of the way. We have got to get, I tell people all the time that while we spend probably 80% of our capital in the traditional energy business and about 20% in energy transition, we probably spend 80% of all the dollars we get tied up into lawsuits and basically NIMBYism trying to keep us from developing in our energy transition business. Shockingly, it's a lot harder to get a high voltage transmission line permitted in the United States of America than it is an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline. And so this kind of obstructionism, it's anti-development. It's keeping not just oil and gas from getting developed, as some of our panels talked about earlier, but candidly, it's keeping wind and solar and transmission from getting developed in our country. So last thing, I guess last slide, I'll just this is copper, which is kind of the ubiquitous metal for the energy transition. It's really interesting. But you go and you look at, this is, in this case would be true for many of the key metals and minerals. But copper, if you look at it for kind of the decade of the 90s and early 2000s, we weren't investing a lot of money in exploration. We were finding a lot of new resource. But in the last decade, we've basically increased our spending on exploration by a factor of 5, and yet our discoveries went down by 85%. And the reason for this is we found most of the big stuff, or it's in parts of the world we just can't even access. And so we have to understand that it's going to take a lot more capital. It's going to take a lot more time. It's going to be a lot more expensive. The new mines that are going to come on are not going to be able to produce these metals and minerals as cheap as the old existing mines. And that's going to be highly inflationary for this energy transition. So with that, I don't know how much time we have left, or if we have any. Did I blow through all my time? But if not, do we have time for a question or two or no?
Yes.
Yep, 2:35. That's good. I got it done. Okay. Any questions?
My name is Sarah from Saudi. I work for a company that develop and invest renewable energy. I relocated to Shanghai, China 3 months ago, and I'm here in the US as part of an Eisenhower Fellowship. This is very enlightening what you have showed, and I think the true trilemma or the true dilemma is being able to ramp up explorations and investments into the minerals and rare earth materials. But does the world today can afford not having the energy transition while we try to build the infrastructure for that? What could be done in the interim taking into account the geopolitics situation to ensure that we do deliver an energy transition, we do deliver on a reduction of carbon, but at the same time ensuring, the infrastructure is there. So, just looking at the midterm, what could be done in your opinion? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the good news for a lot of the world is they're going to be fine buying all this technology from China, right? So China's they've built an amazing industry here, and they're going to supply a lot of the world that. Now, China, for example, they're electrifying all their transportation. And a lot of people say, well, that's great. They're selling more EVs in China than they are anywhere else in the world. But the reason they're doing that is because they don't have very much oil, but they have a lot of coal. And so what they can do is they can electrify and they can use coal to power their cars. And by the way, they keep their cities a lot cleaner too, because the emissions get now done out in the country, and then they move the electricity in the city over high voltage wires. And I just say that is every country is going to have to decide for themselves where are their natural competitive advantages. So in America, for example, we have a tremendous amount of natural gas. We have carbon capture and storage technology that within 4 to 5 years, this can be mainstream technology. We have nuclear technology here. And so every country is going to have to say, where do we have actually, by the way, if you look at a map, I didn't put it in the slide deck, but I've got a map of the world that shows where all the best wind and the best solar resource is. And good news for the United States and Mexico, and therefore Canada is a byproduct of that. Other than Australia, the United States is the most endowed country or continent, and North America is the most endowed continent in the world for wind and solar resource. How much the wind blows, how much the sun shines. So over time, that's going to be extraordinarily beneficial for North America. The flip side that's true is like Europe, horrible solar resource. Like they should never put in solar panels in Europe. They got really good offshore wind though, right? And so every country is going to have to look at where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and the world will sort that out. But to your point is a very fair one. I'm not at all saying we should not go full bore ahead. We have to do everything we can to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. But every country has to say where can they make the biggest impact. In the United States, longer term, we need to be planning. We really do need a Manhattan Project in the U.S. to reestablish the United States as the preeminent, because we have the technology. We have the ability to do this. Technology, manufacturing brings jobs back. So I'm very optimistic, but it's going to take time. So. Any other? Yes.
My name is Sanjay Sharma. I teach a course on green tech finance here in Marshall, and I'm from the banking world. Well, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. If you had carte blanche over the next 5 years, let's say that you had a government checkbook or whatever, what are the 3 measures that you think you will take, because the problem seems to be enormous?
What are the things I would do if I had carte blanche over the United States? I would, first and foremost, I would absolutely address permitting reform. I think the IRA did so many great things. Where it most fell short was it did not address permitting reform. So that's everything from getting, wind farms, solar farms, high voltage transmission, low voltage transmission, pipeline. I would get mining, all those things. I would clear out the regulatory red tape. That would probably be number 1. Number 2, I would probably go all in with nuclear. Nuclear technology is not something we should be scared of. And I would get part of that is also regulatory red tape. They're building nuclear power plants in China and South Korea for 1/3 to 40% of what we're building them for, or what we can build them for in the United States. We're not building them in the United States, but so I think I would really, really focus in on nuclear. I think the other thing I'd really advance hard is, and it's all related to regulatory reform, but carbon capture. I would very much push that forward in a very, very aggressive way. And I'd say fourth, I would probably double down on the IRA and really bring back manufacturing, the ability to refine and process this stuff in the United States and then turn that into finished product. So that's probably the 4 things I'd do. So that's all the time I have. Thank you.